So poetry is a terrible form of communication. It's a terrible form of communication, right? Like poetry does not exist to clearly communicate. How many of you have struggled in a class at any point in an English class where a teacher has given you a poem or you've had to read a poem? It's like during a poetry unit or whatever. And you either ask yourself the question or you ask the teacher the question, what does this mean? Is that familiar? Like you've had to answer, like you've tried to answer, what does this poem mean? Right? Like, so when we see it on a test, in this case, AP literature test, right? We have this conditioned assumption that poetry means something specific, right? That there's like a right and there's a wrong for what a poem could mean, right? Let me ask you this. Why does poetry exist? I will wait patiently. That is not a rhetorical question. Why do you think humans created poetry? What's the purpose? What's like the ultimate purpose of poetry? What do you think? To send a message? Okay. Good. But why does poetry exist, right? So we've got message, which yes, but also can books have a message? Can newspaper articles have a message? Okay, so we know that having a message is not unique to poetry as a form of writing, right? So in that case, it kind of cancels out. What about poetry is different than other forms of written communication? Jibu, it's more sneaky. Yeah, it is. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by sneaky? I love that you said that. But tell me more so that I'm thinking of what you're thinking of. How is poetry sneaky? Okay, this can be like a song which sounds like music. Yes, right. You can get into arguments like, are song lyrics poetry or are they something else? Right. We're not getting into that. Hidden message in the poem, right? So notice it says help understand in a different form than books, etc. Hidden message in the poem. Okay, but again, other things also carry messages, and yet poetry is very different, right? Yes, it's not as direct. Okay, it's not as direct. Absolutely, right? Have you ever heard, or have you ever even said or considered that poetry is like, quote unquote, like a form of expression? Poetry is a form of expression. Have you heard that? Like, or does that make sense to you? Okay, what type of expression? If we were to narrow down the types of expression that poetry has or does for us, for the audience, what would we say that poetry does the best job expressing? What does poetry express the best? Yes. All right, Jibu, great job. All right, so emotions, right? Also, you can appreciation could definitely fall under there, but that would be like a very specific type or form within the poetry's expression, right? So poetry, like any form of art, exists for two reasons. For two reasons. Number one, to express something from the perspective of the artist, in this case, poet, right? And also, if it does that well, if the person does that well, it also connects to the audience, right? So poetry is twofold, right? It's a give and a take, right? So it gives voice to the expression of the artist, and in response, the audience can take that and connect to it, right? That's the only reason why poetry exists. That's the only reason why literally any form of art exists, is to express and to connect. Full stop. Michelangelo, Raphael, Da Vinci, right? Like think of literally like any artist, Banksy, right? Like to street art that is contemporary, right? Like no matter what form of art, think of music, think of songs, think of music that doesn't even have words, right? Like think of like orchestras, right? Anything, literature, poetry, like anything that is art or could be defined as art, regardless of how it does it, all art is intended to connect to the audience and to express an idea from the artist, right? Like that's why it's there, right? Okay, here's why it's so like Jibu, exactly. Like if it's for connecting, why is it so confusing? Think about this. How frustrating is it when you're having a bad day? Someone tries to fix it for you. Someone tries to tell you what you need to do with your bad day. How frustrating is that? Or do you like that? Like when you're like, man, I've had a crappy day. Like this happened, that happened. Someone told me this. It hurt my feelings. Like, how many of you really like it when someone goes, you know what you need to do? You need to do this for that. You need to do this for that. And you need to go here for that. Right? They like jump in to your problems and make you a project and like try to fix you because they think they know what you need. How frustrating is that? Not at all. Very, extremely. Okay. Let's talk about how American public education has failed you with regard to poetry. Okay? Poetry was never meant to exist as a form of effective communication. It's always existed as a form of connection and expression, right? Those things often do not make sense, right? When I say they don't make sense, like, have you ever identified that you're feeling some type of way and you don't know why? Like, is that familiar? Have you ever had the experience of feeling something emotionally and not really be able to explain it? Okay. And if someone comes up to you and you're like having this emotion, and it's not about this person, it's not about whoever comes up to you, whether it's your mom or your friend or whoever. If they come up to you when you don't know how you're feeling, but you're in your feelings, how helpful is it when they go, what is it that you're feeling? What do you need? How can I fix this? Is that helpful? Do you feel like they see you when they do that? I mean, do you feel like people respect you or like value what you're going through when they try to fix emotional problems that don't belong to them? This is what we have done in public education. We have taught you that every single word, sentence, stanza, paragraph means something specific. That is why we ask you, or have asked you in the past. I mean, y'all are like about to graduate in, I don't know, 7 weeks. And probably not very many of you have ever had it explained to you like this, that the problem with understanding poetry is exactly that. Poetry is not meant to be like understood in a conventional, like, here's my sentence, here's what it means type way. Poetry is meant to be felt, right? Emotions are meant to be felt. We have emotions for a reason, right? Whenever you're feeling like crap, either emotionally or physically or whatever, have you ever had the experience where someone who has like toxic positivity like tries to talk you out of your negative feelings, and you just like, it only makes you want to punch them in the throat? Right? Like if I'm feeling angry, I don't need your good vibes only junk all up in my face, because that's going to make me want to punch you. I'm angry for a reason. I want to process my anger, right? And this is a huge deal, especially for men, right? Because we don't allow boys, and we don't teach men, we don't teach males oftentimes how to express negative emotions effectively, or like even positive emotions effectively. Like we only accept anger from men, or happiness, right? Socially. So you can see why people are confused. If they feel rejected, how does a man behave? Well, he behaves like he's angry, because that's negative. If a man is disappointed, if a man is sad, he behaves as though he's angry, because anger is the most acceptable form of negative emotion that we accept socially from men. Poetry is meant to express all of these things. And we connect to them not because like we understand them, but we connect to them because we understand them. Right? Now that seems cliche and whatever, but I really want you to consider that the reason you have been taught that poetry is confusing, or the reason you think poetry is confusing, is that you have been taught in school to ask a poem what it means and not how it feels. You've been taught to read the room wrong. I mean, how awkward is that when you can tell that someone's going through something? You're like, oh, I'm really sorry you're sad. And they're like, I'm not sad, I'm angry. And you like got it wrong. And you're like, oh, well, add me to the list of things you're mad about now, since I got that wrong. Right? And that's very frustrating for us, right? When we're in our emotions for whatever reason, and someone misidentifies that, or they want to like fix our emotions because it makes them uncomfortable. Like, I'm sorry, I don't need you to stand here and try to fix my problem. I need you to like sit down and be with me. Right? Like, does that make sense? Right? Like, you've been taught by well-meaning, good-intended English teachers from the time that you were in elementary school that all poems and all ideas in poetry have meanings, and that's just not true. I mean, listen to some of the music, listen to some of the lyrics that you hear in songs nowadays. Like, they don't logically make sense, but they sound nice, or they feel true, right? Like it feels true, even though you like couldn't explain, a particular lyric, right? So poetry, in order to really understand it, you've got to change your frame of mind around it, right? And that poetry is not meant to be understood logically. Poetry is meant to be connected to on a much more abstract and much deeper level, right? And you are bearing the brunt of dozens of years worth of poor instruction around poetry, right? But when you realize that poetry doesn't exist as an effective form of communication, you kind of let that go, and it really kind of opens your eyes and liberates you to be able to understand the poem for what it is and what it is doing. It's much easier to pick up on the messages when you can feel how the poem feels, right? If you've ever lost someone, I don't just mean like death, right? Like we lose people in our lives because their lives and our lives kind of take different turns at different points. People in our lives oftentimes have seasons, right? They're here for a little bit, they're here for a long time, and then for whatever reason they're gone. And sometimes we do lose people who have passed away, right? If you've ever been in that position and lost someone, do you ever feel comforted, or do you imagine that you would feel comforted if someone said to you, once they heard that you'd lost someone, if they said to you, "Oh, I understand how you feel"? Do you think that would bring you comfort? I understand how you feel. Why don't you think that would bring you comfort? For someone to just say, "I get it, like I understand how you feel." Why would that not be comforting? Or like they say, "I know what you're going through." Do you? Are you me? Do you have my experiences? Really? Right, there you go. It could be a lie. Sometimes, I mean, honestly, like people just they don't know what to say. A lot of times they're just saying something that they think they should, but the problem is that those things don't really connect where we need connection, right? And when we lose someone, when we have like a sense of grief or a sense of loss, the thing that makes the most difference is when we feel like people see and recognize where we are without expectation, right? What that means, like what that can look like is I mean, this is personal. My dad passed away in February of 2016. All right, so however many was that? 16, 5 years ago. 5 years ago in February. All right, so my dad passed away back then, and up until that point, I had not lost personally many people close to me. Right, like he was really, like my grandmothers had died, but I didn't really know them too deeply, beyond like phone conversations and stuff like that. My dad was like one of the first people that I lost that was like a great and deep personal loss, right? Got a ton of phone calls, like lots of phone calls, lots of texts. Like there were a lot of people reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, I'm sorry for your loss. Hey, I really liked your dad. Hey, I know how that feels," right? But the one time I really, really felt like someone was entering into my pain with me was when I called my best friend from high school, Trey Macon, and our dads. We'd known each other since like before school, right? Like our parents had been friends, pretty much since we were born. They'd gone to the same church, stuff like that, right? So Trey, in a lot of ways, was more of a brother to me than my brother was, who was like 10 years older. When I called Trey, he was the first phone call I made when I found out that my dad, my wife already knew, right? He was the first phone call that I made after my dad's death. And on the phone, he was quiet for a second. And I knew that he was processing it too, because my dad was like a second dad to him. He'd grown up at my house, vice versa. Like his dad, when his dad passed away last year, he was very, like I always called his dad on Father's Day. He always called my dad on Father's Day, type thing. Like he was very close to my dad as well. And he thought for a second, and the only thing he said, fuck. And in that moment, I knew that he knew exactly how I felt. No amount of like, I understand what this is like, where I've been there, or I lost my father too, or you're going to be okay, or, it's going to be all right. There's brighter days ahead. Look at the bright side, right? Like look for the silver lining. I'm sorry for your loss. Like none of those came close to that one word that we have made very taboo. It was the one thing that was like, I knew that he felt what I was feeling. I knew it in that moment, that he was hurting the same way that I was hurting. Poetry does that. That's what poetry does. Poetry reaches out and tries to move you in ways that it has been moved to exist by the poet. Poetry is a terrible form of communication. And also, poetry is one of the most powerful ways that words can be used. But we've taught you wrong. We've taught you to ask a poem what it means instead of teaching you to really listen to the poem, like ask it how it feels. One of the best strategies for reading poetry is to read it first for feeling, read it for tone. What emotions can you identify? Are any of those emotions contradictory? Right? That's where you start opening up the complexity of what poetry presents. And that's where the power of it is. Let me tell you something. No poet, no single poet in the history of Earth and Homo sapiens has ever written a poem with the specific intent that it would be on a standardized test. Nobody has ever written a poem because it was going to be on a standardized test. Even though you have to read them on standardized tests, AP, whatever. Your best bet in approaching the poetry on an exam is to read it for itself. And I know that's hard because it's like not like you're sitting down for a test, like who wants to be there, right? But that poem, whatever it is, did not exist for the purpose of being put on that test. And so do not hold it against that poem. Read the poem for itself and ask it, what can I feel? Right? Like, what do you feel? You want to sit with that poem. And this is like very kind of hoodoo and whatever. But that poem, I guarantee you, it does not exist for the purpose of being a source of analytical multiple choice questions on a collegiate high school exam. It's not there for that reason. So do the poem the dignity of reading it for itself. Reading it for itself. It doesn't exist for that exam. It exists because that poet, whoever they were, had something to express and they put it down on paper in order to reach out and make a connection with someone else. Reading poetry is like entering a relationship, right? We want to connect. We want to connect with people. We want to take our experiences and share them in ways that other people recognize our humanity, our struggles, our triumphs, our emotions. That is why poetry exists. Full stop. Expression, connection. Poetry doesn't exist to be analyzed on an exam. So don't look at the poetry on the exam just as a barrier to your analysis. Do it the favor, do it the justice, do it the dignity of reading it for finding how the poet wants to connect with you. I think that you'll find that they make much more sense in an emotional way than they do like a comprehension way. Right? And that's one of the most important things that I could tell you about poetry is we have to reframe the way that we've been taught to think about language specifically with poetry, because there are many other forms of excellent communication and effective communication. And poetry is not an effective way to communicate. Right? You've also heard that, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, you've also heard that like different, that because poetry is open to interpretation, that like nothing can be wrong. Well, in Shakespeare's Sonnet 76, is he talking about potatoes being abducted by aliens? No. So it can't be just about anything. There's no such thing as like a right or wrong interpretation. There's only reasonable and unreasonable interpretations. What AP wants you to do is to find and to explore the reasonable interpretations of the poem. Right? More on Tuesday. Thank you for being here. Y'all have a great day.